The Mayo Experience.
That Mayo Experience. That Mayo Experience. That Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience presented by DraftKings 2020 Week 3 DraftKings picks and preview. When I say picks, my guest will have good picks. Pat Mayo, probably not good picks, as evidenced by Week 2. Week 1, we'll throw that out as an aberration with good picks. Week 2, probably what you're used to here. If you want to play in the best tournament on DraftKings, besides all of the other ones, but really the best one, the Pat Mayo Experience Listeners League on DraftKings. You can find the link in the description of this video and podcast. $15 to play, 3 max entry, no rake whatsoever. Flat payouts, too. That's why it's the best tournament. You min cash in the Pat Mayo Experience Open, you get double your money. It's not one of these, $15, you get $17.50 back. No. Get at least 30 for min cash, and you need to have that. That's why top prize isn't like all the money. It's only like 5,000 or 7,500, whatever it is. Anyway, best tournament on DraftKings, play in that. Smash the like for the episode. Give me your favorite sleeper on the DraftKings main slate this week. Now, I say main slate because, once again, although I said it last week, we were talking about the main Millionaire Maker slate only. So, Sunday early games, Sunday late games, that's it. That's why we're not talking about Sunday Night Football. We're not talking about Monday Night Football. If you want to hear about Thursday Night Football, go to Mayo Media Network on YouTube. Subscribe to it, by the way. Check out David Jones's Thursday Night Football DraftKings Showdown Breakdown, which is up there right now. Just go check that out if you want to hear about the fucking Thursday game. I don't want to hear about it because that's not what we're talking about. Sorry to be so upset. Review the podcast. 5 stars if you like it too. Also, all the tools and stats I will be talking about today are from FTNDaily.com. You want an optimizer? Boom, FTNDaily.com. It's up there. Quarterback, wide receiver tools powered by Jeff Radcliffe. That is up there at FTNDaily.com. O-line, D-line, shadow coverage, air yards. All the stats you need to get ahead are all up at FTNDaily.com. Use code Mayo. Get yourself a discount. Joining me on the line from not FTNDaily.com, from EstablishTheRun.com, a rival site, but a good man. It's Drew Dinkmeyer. What's up?
I'm just thrilled to be here after that intro. I'm sure you've taken care of all the YouTube commenters, and they will know exactly what to do.
Yeah, well, how could anything go wrong? You know how good people are at listening, Drew.
Yeah, they're very good at listening, at reading the fine print. They're very good at following directions. It's a very well-organized society out there. I'm sure they'll take care of it well.
Yeah, when we talk about society, organization, and good organization is always the first thing that comes to my mind. I really wanted to have you on this week because, A, talking to guys that, have won some Million Makers is kind of nice. Would lend some credibility to the show, so thank you for that. Me not winning Millionaire Makers, you winning Millionaire Makers. That's how we're going to try to parse that out. But you're also doing something actually really good for society, and that is the Welly Maker campaign. So can you tell people what's going on with the Welly Maker and how they can help support you and that cause?
Yeah, and I only have a few more years on my statute of limitations on this Welly Maker win, so we really gotta roll through it because in 3 more years, after 7 years, I think it's up, and you just got to move on to somebody else. The Welly Maker is a campaign that I've been partnering with the good folks at Charity Water. They're an organization that is dedicated to solving the water crisis around the world. The water crisis being people around the world that don't have access to clean, sustainable drinking water solutions. They're having to travel miles a day to get access to water, and usually it's very dirty water that they're using to clean themselves and drink and whatnot, and it leads to malnourishment and keeps kids out of school and all these other things. So they're a great organization. I've partnered with them the last 4 years. This is Welly Maker 4.0. It's running through the end of September. And the idea behind the Welly Maker is, I've played this Millie Maker year after year. I've obviously taken shots to change my life and have accomplished that. And so my thought process behind it was set aside a few entries that you would normally enter into the Millie Maker each and every year, dedicate to the Welly Maker, and instead of taking a chance at changing your life, guarantee changing someone else's life. Because on estimate, it's about $20 to $40, somewhere around there, to deliver clean, sustainable water to a single person for the rest of their life. And that affects generations thereafter, gives people longer longevity, gives them the ability to create businesses and just live a full and happy and accomplished life. So if you want more information on it, you can check out my Twitter at Drew Dinkmeyer. There's a pinned tweet there where you can donate as well. But we're running through the end of September. We're matching all donations. We've raised over $32,000 so far this year. raised over $100,000 last year, which was incredible. So we're super excited and thrilled to be partnering with Charity Water once again.
Yeah, well, you set the bar a bit high with the $100,000 last year. So let's try to get at least close to that number again this year. So go to Drew's Twitter profile once again, like he mentioned, at Drew Dinkmeyer on Twitter. The pinned tweet that's up there right now will show you how to do that. If you have to play one less entry in the PME Open this week and you donate your $15 to the Welly Maker, hey, that sounds like a pretty reasonable thing to do. So go check that out right now. But let's talk about some DraftKings. There's a lot of injuries on this slate, Drew, and that's going to open things up for a lot of cheap values, it would appear. The problem we have right now is we don't know exactly who's going to be in and who's going to be out. So how do you like to approach this kind of slate? Like, if you look at the top of the receivers, just from a macro view, you have like 3-4 guys who may or may not play, and even if they do play, it seems like no one wants to play them anyway. So does that make them like good values if they play? Do you stay away from them at that point because they're too banged up? Like, what do you do with these injured guys?
Yeah, with players that are questionable on the injury report, year over year, you've kind of seen that there's a little bit of a decrease in production across the board on players that are listed as questionable. So the question is, does that decrease in expected production come with a decrease in ownership that would make it a worthwhile risk to take on in tournaments? And that's ultimately where this stuff comes down. So a lot of those decisions for me are made, Saturday night and Sunday morning when I'm getting a better idea on what ownership is going to look like for the slate. But in general, I would say, if you're building like one lineup or a cash game lineup or, main tournament lineup, and you just want to take a little bit of risk off the table, in general, wide receivers, running backs that are listed as questionable on the injury report historically have underperformed their baseline expectation.
All right. So again, on the show, we're talking about the main slate, the Millionaire Maker slate. We're talking tournaments only because I don't play cash games. I don't quite understand cash games. Cash games is like going out to a bar or going out to a club, picking up, and when they say, hey, let's get out of here, you're like, you know what? I'm going to go home and beat off instead. That's what cash games are to me versus tournaments. Like, you're shooting for the moon here. That's what you want to do. So let's talk about running backs. Christian McCaffrey is the most expensive, but he's not playing, so he doesn't really matter at this point. He's on the injured reserve. That makes the highest price running back Ezekiel Elliott at $8,300. It's so weird to see the top price running back at $8,300. It seems like it's been a very long time since that's happened. So it's Elliott, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor with a huge price bump up $1,300 to $7,000. And then from $6,500 to $7,000, you have Chubb, Eckler, Connor, Chris Carson, and Raheem Colonel Mostert, who's probably not going to play, but he has not been officially ruled out as we are recording this right now. Tevin Coleman has been. So I want to start with him. So if he plays, no one's going to play him. That kind of makes some sense. Yeah. I don't expect him to play at the Giants. So that leaves Jerick McKinnon, who is completely cursed this week. So I recommend no one play him. Does that mean I have to play Jeff Wilson Jr.?
I think Jeff Wilson Jr., regardless of the Andercuss situation, was probably the more compelling tournament play just in general, because he's the guy that, is coming out of nowhere that'll keep ownership down. McKinnon is, this spark score freak that people have been excited about for years to see kind of in a full role. But we also saw that, San Francisco has reasons to be, conscientious of the workload that they give McKinnon. He's coming off of a big injury. They want to use him as kind of a passing down back. They want to have kind of a backfield rotation. And so as a result, I think McKinnon is the play that's kind of sexy, but a little bit overpriced. And I think Wilson is kind of the play that's a little bit more sneaky and a little bit better of a tournament play. He's down at only 4,000, which, this year on DraftKings with the minimum price level on running backs kind of bumped up. And some of these guys like Mike Davis filling in for Christian McCaffrey up in the 5,000s. You don't get a lot of running backs in the 4,000s that are usable. So I don't think he's going to command a ton of ownership because, as you mentioned, so many of the running backs 8,300 and below are priced at a level that's not really prohibitive of building out strong lineups. So I think you're going to see a lot of those 6,000 to 8,300 running backs garner ownership. And I think Jeffrey Wilson is pretty interesting at 4,000 for tournaments.
So, and when you look at Jeffrey Wilson, and he's the guy that comes in to steal all the touchdowns anyway in like random weeks. So if you just take out some of the guys in the Niners backfield, and then if he somehow lucks his way into, let's say, I don't know, a big share of let's say JaMychal Hasty is active but isn't really a part of this running game whatsoever. Kyle Juszczyk doesn't really do anything besides steal a catch or two, have 2 carries. You hope he doesn't pilfer a touchdown. So then you just have Jarek, and you've narrowed it down to Jeff Wilson Jr. I can see Jeff Wilson Jr. out touching, at least on the ground, like garnering more carries than Jarek. If he's going to garner more carries, I would expect him to be in near the goal line. And it's against the Giants, who stink.
Yeah, I fully agree with all that. I think you also have to think through with the 49ers. This is a team that, their plan is to use McKinnon the whole year. Their plan is not to use Jeffrey Wilson the whole year, right? So in a game against the Giants where they should be playing from ahead, a team that has struggled to stop the run so far, early on, I think this is a great spot to give Jeff Wilson 15 carries and give McKinnon his 10 touches with most, half of those coming through the passing game, and maybe working a little bit of hasty and with Wilson getting the goal line work. So I think it's not that unreasonable to think that Wilson could project ahead of McKinnon in terms of overall touches in this situation, just when you think about what the 49ers are trying to accomplish for the rest of the year, when you already have some running backs banged up and you're trying to get through the whole year with a rotation of guys. And you've got this player coming off this severe injury on a turf that they've already noted they have concerns about playing on. I think it's a good spot for Jeff Wilson.
So what do we actually, besides Jeff Wilson, if you want to throw him in tournament plays, I tend to like him this week. Last week, I had a choice between Zeke and Derrick Henry. It came down to those two. Guess who I chose, Drew?
I'm going to guess Derrick Henry based on your intro into the show, Pat.
Yeah, it wasn't great. But 25 carries on the ground, 84 yards. The 25 carries is fantastic. He gets out again.
Yeah.
If you can tell me I can take a running back and he's going to get 25 carries in a game, probably going to play that guy more often than not. So am I just going back to him again against Minnesota?
I think he's an exceptional play once again. I mean, we saw last week with Indianapolis, they just fed the ball to Jonathan Taylor over and over again against Minnesota. Minnesota's offense has struggled so much early in the season in terms of sustaining drives, and other teams have just been able to do whatever they want at the line of scrimmage with them. So I think it's another good spot for Derrick Henry. I think the ownership will be much, much more in check after last week. He was one of the highest owned players alongside Zeke, alongside Jonathan Taylor last week. I think that'll come down and makes him certainly in play, both for cash games and tournaments. Honestly, again, I know some people are going to feel like, oh, you can't go back to him at those prices near 8,000 cash games without a passing game role. But I mean, you're looking at, I don't know, the floor on him might be 18 touches and the ceiling is 35. I mean, we saw him get the ball 30 times in week 1. And as long as Darrington Evans is still out, they don't really have a backup running back on the roster that they trust. So I know, they moved the ball. They scored 30 points last week. None of it went to him in the red zone. That's a little bit of an anomaly. I would expect a bounce back week from Derrick Henry this week.
Do you think he is the best play from this top end? If you're going to eat the chalk on one of these guys, would it be him? Or do you continuously have to roll out Zeke just because the over-under in that game is so ridiculous?
Yeah, so if you're talking top end guys like just Zeke and Derrick Henry and Dalvin, I would say Henry is kind of the best guy. But once you get down to Taylor and even a little bit further into James Conner, Sanders, I think because of prices you start to get some competition there. So I would say Jonathan Taylor of that 7K and up group is probably my favorite play.
Really?
And then I think Zeke and Henry are pretty similar after that.
So I guess I have a few concerns about Jonathan Taylor in this matchup, despite the fact that Colonel Mostert was able to take it 80 yards to the house against the Jets on the first play of the game. They actually held the running game in check after that. They held the running game in check in week 1. They were one of the top 3 teams in football against the run last year. So I'm not totally convinced that all of a sudden the Jets have a bad run defense, and that seemed like what they wanted to do with Jonathan Taylor, just kind of run him up the gut, run him up the gut, run him up the gut. I actually think this is kind of a trap game for the Colts. I think this game is going to be a little bit closer. The Colts don't really impress me all that much. And Rivers can kind of turn the ball over into close games a lot of the time. And I do worry that unless they jump out by a bunch, everything that we expected last week where, that was a 3-point game, it's going to be close. We're going to see some Taylor, but we're going to see a lot of Nyheim Hines too. This game starts being within 7 points, not the blowout like everyone kind of expects, like we saw with the Colts last week, that I think we're going to get 40% Hines in this game.
That will be really interesting to monitor because, I was of the belief, and I played Hines a decent bit in tournaments last week because I thought Hines was a great pivot off Taylor last week. But I thought, after week 1, we saw them in more neutral game scripts against the Jags. We saw Hines on the field quite a bit. So I kind of thought that would hold. It really didn't hold in week 2. And so it's interesting to see how game script dependent these two are going to be. The thing that I'll note about Taylor, though, is if the game script is more neutral, yes, he's probably sharing the field a little bit more with Hines, but he's also catching more passes. We saw him catch 6 balls in week 1. We saw the receptions kind of come down in week 2. And I still think there's a lot of different paths for success there with Jonathan Taylor. And I think the one path that you're concerned about most is if they get, play from behind and the game script really goes against him. And it's just really hard to see the Jets with the way they're playing offensively, pulling ahead from anybody enough that it would kind of force that situation. So I think Taylor and Henry are somewhat similar. Henry's, base volume is a little bit more guaranteed. But I think for $800 cheaper with a little bit more of a defined passing game role, I like Taylor slightly more than Henry.
It's going to be about the savings this week. And if you're not going to be paying up at wide receiver, which with all these injuries, maybe you can't even at this point, that you might have the extra money to go up and get Henry. I would just feel better about that because regardless if they're winning or losing, he's probably still going to get his 25 touches either way. And they're probably all going to be carries for some reason, even if they're down by 14. Just turn around and hand the ball off to Derrick Henry. I think Taylor's interesting, to say the least, just because I don't have a great feel for it. That, I'm a coward, so that would lead me away from him. That's probably the variance you want to embrace. Can he get up to 25 touches in this game, even if it's pieced together through 18 on the ground and like 7 through the air, depending on how fast-paced this game is? The Jets are playing at an incredibly fast pace. Now, they're always down by 40 points, so that tends to make a bit more sense. I don't know. I'm just kind of iffy on the entire thing. If you went below that, you have like the Chubbs. Like, I guess I don't want to leave Aaron Jones for a second, because if Devontae Adams doesn't play, like the splits with Adams and Jones, like with Devontae Adams not in the picture and Aaron Jones on the field, I don't care how much 1A, 1B talk they're doing. Aaron Jones eats when Devontae Adams gets hurt.
Yeah. And the reason is, Devontae Adams is just eating up so much of the target share that you start getting Aaron Jones into a situation where he's got the potential to land a 15% target share or something like that, or even higher. And that passing game volume is just huge. And obviously he's been a very efficient back during the course of his career. He was obviously the big difference making player in week 2. If you had him, he was one of the players that Mike Leone and myself had identified as one of the best tournament plays on the slate. So it was a good week for us as a result. I think he'll command ownership after last week, which is the tricky part. So I would personally like to see Devontae Adams in to kind of spread the ownership between those two. It's a situation with Green Bay, though, where they don't have a ton of offensive playmakers, right? They notoriously invested this draft capital in 2 players they're not even playing this year in the first and second round, with a backup quarterback and a third string running back. So it'll be a very interesting injury situation to follow with Devontae Adams, but that's obviously one that has a huge impact on Aaron Jones.
So I think that the must-have play of week 3 is in this $6,000 range. And again, this tool up on ftndaily.com for both offense and defense shows adjusted line yards for the offensive line and adjusted line yards against for the defensive line. So if you look at the bottom 5 in the league right now through 2 weeks in adjusted line yards against, you have Cincinnati, the Raiders, the Texans, the Rams, and the Lions. Now, Kenyon Drake's shaping up. He's still cheap for some reason. I guess the touchdowns really haven't followed. And the 30 touches and the big runs haven't happened. But Miles Sanders is sitting there. I don't know why he wasn't bumped up in price at all, but he's $6,400 against a bad defense.
Yeah, I think Miles Sanders is the best play on the slate at the running back position. And I think it's not particularly close. You've got a situation with Philadelphia where they brought him back in week 2. Week 1, apparently the injury wasn't so severe. It was more of we want to make sure he's 100%. And then they gave those indications during the course of the week after some full practices that he was going to be unleashed. And he was 20 plus touches, got a lot of goal line work in the passing game. And now you've got a situation again where Jalen Reagor hurt again for Philadelphia with a UCL sprain in his thumb, I believe. And so you've just got this issue where they don't have a lot of options to throw the ball, that they're going to throw the ball confidently to. So you're going to see more Zach Ertz, you're going to see more Dallas Goedert, you're obviously going to see some Deshaun Jackson shots down the field, but you're going to see an awful lot of Miles Sanders. And the last time we saw Cincinnati, we saw Nick Chubb running up and down the field. We saw Kareem Hunt running up and down the field. And I think this week we'll see Miles Sanders running up and down the field.
Yeah, and he gets enough work in the passing game, too, that if he can't get it going on the ground, you still think that he's locked into those goal line touches, but he might pick up 4, 5, 6 catches along the way. And I can see the same thing with Drake, too, in an easier matchup against the Lions. For reference, the 5 best teams in adjusted line yards against, so the most difficult defenses to run on, at least on a per-play basis so far this year, have been the Steelers, the Jets, Jets, the Saints, the Browns, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But Washington is inside the top 10 as well. And I know I actually can't get a good feel for Nick Chubb. I don't want to play him, but do you think people will want to play him?
I don't think so. I think if you look at kind of this list of options, people are going to want to play Zeke. People are going to want to play. I think people are going to want to play Jonathan Taylor because he rewarded their faith last week. I think people are going to want to play Chris Carson just because the game environment, the Dallas-Seattle total will be enough. And Carson's done enough with touchdown variance early in the season to kind of get there and reward people. And I think people want to play Miles Sanders and Kenyon Drake. So I think Chubb is going to fall a little bit by the wayside. I think Austin Eckler is going to be a guy people want to play as well. So I think Chubb is going to go modestly owned at most. I don't think he'll be highly owned.
I think I'm going to pass on Nick Chubb here. Eckler, I don't know whether he's going to be popular or not because I can see people just paying down for Joshua Kelly instead.
That could be the case. And obviously Carolina has been a pretty favorable run defense to go against in general, and one that you want to be able to attack. But it's really not that. This is the thing with the DraftKings pricing this year. It's not that big of a difference. I know like 1,800 feels like so much, but when you've got one guy who catches passes and the other guy who's unproven in that role, and I think the nice thing that we saw from the Chargers version of the offense last week with Justin Herbert, who's going to start again this week, pending he doesn't get attacked by his own training staff, is that they're going to throw the ball and they're going to check the ball down to the running backs a little bit. There were more designed kind of passing plays for Austin Eckler in that game. So it'll be interesting to see the ownership discrepancy between those two players, because I think Eckler is very clearly a strong play, and I think Kelly is more of an okay play. And given the strength of the running back plays on the slate, I probably won't have very much Josh Kelly at all.
I think I'd just rather have Mike Davis right where Joshua Kelly is from the same game, although it's a tougher matchup. I think that he is probably going to be, it depends on if they activate Reggie Bonifon towards the end, because I don't think Trenton Cannon's going to be doing anything. So if you can lock him into like the 80% of the snap share and have them trailing, and he's just going to be the guy standing in front of Teddy Bridgewater, just soaking up receptions like at the end of last week, like he's going to pay off the 5,100 pretty quickly, it seems like. But with Eckler, my biggest problem is, well, the matchup is great, and maybe this works out for DraftKings tournaments. I just don't think he's going to have any close scores. Like, if he's going to score, it's almost like the Devin Singletary thing from last year, where if he's going to score, it's going to be more than a 20-yard touchdown. Because when they get in close, it's either Herbert calling his own number, or it's Joshua Kelly.
Well, he has gotten some looks there. He rotated series there kind of in game one, and then Kelly was used a little bit more kind of in game two. So it will be interesting to see how they go forward on that. But that's obviously the concern with Eckler, and that's the thing that will probably keep ownership down. I think the good news, obviously, is if the ownership is kept down at all, Eckler is so good at breaking big plays. This is something we've seen throughout his career, really, that he doesn't necessarily need the short yardage to get there, right? He can get there through the passing game and through breaking off 20-plus yard plays. So I think he's very interesting in tournaments. And then who you mentioned before, Kenyon Drake, I think it'll be really interesting to see what the field does with Kenyon Drake, because so far, what we've seen from Arizona is a very concentrated offensive effort through DeAndre Hopkins and Kyler Murray. And Kyler Murray is doing so much damage on the ground that Kenyon Drake has been somewhat limited in those opportunities. But you also look at kind of who Arizona has faced the first 2 weeks. And they faced San Francisco. This was before the Nick Bosa injury. And as a result, they had one of the strongest defensive lines and one of the best pass rushes in the league. And Washington, also one of the best pass rushes in the league. And that encourages Kyler Murray to run. Detroit does not. Detroit has no pass rush. It's basically a pretty clean pocket whenever you want to sit back there. And so as a result, I'm interested to see if Kenyon Drake gets a little bit more of the workload. It's been frustrating that Chase Edmonds has kind of snuck in and captured some of the role in the passing game. And as a result, I think there's a lot of question marks about how to project Kenyon Drake. And I'm really interested to see what that does to his ownership, because you've got one of the highest individual team totals on the slate with Arizona, over 30 here. And you've got a 6K running back that everybody liked in the preseason, had him going, late first round, early second round in seasonal drafts. And that should be a smash. But I think because of the first 2 weeks and because people are going to want to play Kyler, I think Drake's ownership might get a little bit cut in this game to where it's not overbearing. And I think he's going to be one of the more interesting plays on the slate.
If you wanted to pivot, and let's say you still wanted to use Kyler, I would expect people to use Kyler and DeAndre Hopkins. Could you just take Hopkins out of that, or maybe not even take him out of it, but add Drake into that stack because he is going to catch passes?
You can add Drake into it. I think if you're playing Kyler, he needs to be paired with at least one wide receiver. Because yes, Kyler and Drake can connect on a touchdown, but otherwise, if they don't, then you're looking at basically finding a way that Kyler gets like 2 rushing touchdowns and Drake gets 2 rushing touchdowns. And it's more likely that Kyler, would have passing touchdowns. So I think Kyler should always be paired with a wide receiver or tight end. But I do think Drake can be added into those because he's not particularly expensive. They have a team total that's enough that it could support 3 Kyler Murray passing touchdowns and 2 Kenyon Drake rushing touchdowns, and that's enough.
Okay, so the other guys from this range, you have Leonard Fournette with a big price boost. I don't know if I'm necessarily buying all the way into Leonard Fournette, especially at this price with much better pay down options. He's at 62. Kareem Hunt, I think, is a better play than Nick Chubb at $6,100, but almost like the Jets being sneaky in that Colts game. I like Washington against the Browns. I just don't think the Browns are all that good, and I think the pressure from up front, which you talked about, is going to get to Baker Mayfield. So you might need the quick dump-off guy on the field in closer games. You might not be able to run it up the middle for 6 yards per carry here. But it's actually James Conner, because the Texans' run defense has been really bad through 2 games.
It has.
Against the Chiefs and the Ravens.
Right, against the 2 best teams in the NFL, arguably. So it's tough. It's tough to gauge. But I think Connor's a really strong play, too. Our first set of projections run has Connor as the second best value overall at the running back position behind Miles Sanders. He got the bulk of the workload last week. It was kind of slow go for him until the very end of the game when he busted off a really, really long run. But he was consistently getting the bulk of the work. The challenge was the Steelers were just so pass happy last game, and they didn't really face much of a pass rush. So they were getting kind of the looks they want down the field. And so I think it'll be interesting to see with Connor if he can hold that workload. Obviously, Benny Snell looked good in week 1. I think I'm really interested to see the ownership on like Connor and Eckler and Carson. So all these guys are priced right around one another, and someone is going to get forgotten and be a really good tournament play. And I'm just not sure who it is yet. I kind of came into the week thinking this would be a really good Carson leverage week because I thought people were really going to be on that Seattle-Dallas passing game, but I think people are still going to play Carson in those mixes. So I don't know. Maybe it's Eckler. Who do you think would be the lowest owned of that trio?
It's probably going to be Connor, but here's my hot take on the entire thing. I think that no one is going to use these guys because I think it's a very clear build of what you can do at running back. You can use, it's just like, I don't think anyone's going to own Dalvin Cook against the Titans.
Yeah.
Like it'll be Zeke or Henry. That will be your first running back.
Yeah.
And then Miles Sanders will be your second running back.
Yeah.
And then
Drake.
And then you want to save money. Now it'll be like Mike Davis or Jerick McKinnon or one of the cheap guys just to round out your roster because people want to pay up. Maybe if DeAndre Hopkins is the only decent pay up receiver who's not hurt, maybe that changes things. But if people can find cheap running backs, they're going to play cheap running backs.
It'll be interesting because there are some cheap wide receivers as well that can really open up salary. So I can see it like kind of either way, but I really think the best plays at the running back position on this slate are in the 6K range. And if it's not going to be played, man, they're really good tournament plays.
Yeah, you could go like Sanders, Drake, Connor as your 2 running backs in a flex, and it's not like you're paying all the way up to the top.
No, that's like the same type of spend as Zeke and like Davis and Sanders. Like Zeke and Davis are 13-ish, and Connor and Carson or whatever are 13-ish. Like it's the same. And I think there's way more upside in the 2 6K guys than there is Zeke and Davis. I think Davis he's a guy that's going to look good on projections. People are going to play him, and through 3 quarters, they're going to be furious with themselves for playing him. They're just going to be like, what did I do? Like, how did I play this guy who has like 27 rushing yards on like 10 carries and he has 2 catches and Carolina can't move the ball? And then it'll come down to whether he gets enough checkdowns to kind of pay it off. And he certainly can at 5,100, but I'm skeptical of the upside for Mike Davis. So like, I'd much rather play these 6K guys than Mike Davis in tournaments.
So if we do talk about these sub $6,000 running backs, I think Davis has to be talked about as one of the legitimate options that's down there.
Yeah.
I think Joshua Kelly is, I don't want to say a legit option, but I guess if people are going to do that build that I just said, they're going to use Davis over, they're going to use Kelly, but that's a potential high upside game. I did see, I mean, Jarek is right there. If Mossart is actually ruled out, people will use him at 4,900. Like I said, I prefer Jeff Wilson in that sense. But Zach Moss missed practice today on Wednesday. We're speaking on a Wednesday evening. You're watching this at earliest Thursday morning at 5 a.m. when the show comes out. That's when shows come out for the Pat Mayo Experience, by the way, if you didn't know that. But Devin Singletary is $4,900, and the Rams kind of shitty against the run.
Yeah, it would be really interesting if Moss sat. They're just running so much of that offense through Josh Allen. Their situation neutral adjusted pass rate is skyrocketed this year. They're playing a little bit faster. They're doing a lot of like analytics oriented things that I only know because I work with Mike Leone, who is just like on cloud nine that the Bills are doing smart things and Josh Allen looks like a potential MVP candidate. So I'm interested, but if there was no Moss, certainly like 4,900, he would be a better play to me than Mike Davis, a better play than Josh Kelly, a better play than
Jarek
McKinnon. Yeah, a better play than all those guys. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And then other than that, like if you looked at it, like Jeff Wilson, if you want to pay the minute 4,000, that makes sense to me. Naheem Hines is really the only other one. I guess you could talk yourself into Gibson or even James Robinson in the 5.
Yeah.
Or not James
so
Robinson, but
Gibson is interesting just because he started to take a decent portion of the workload. But Cleveland's defensive front is pretty good, and Washington's offensive line is not so good. So it's not the greatest spot, but there's going to be a big Antonio Gibson game at some point. So I don't mind taking a chance on him in tournaments. I don't mind DeAndre Swift's price tag in tournaments in like game stack situations for Detroit and Arizona, and just hope he gets the role that everybody is going to project for Mike Davis in terms of pass catching volume, just with like a little bit more efficiency. And then the guy that I would say below 6,000 that you didn't mention there, that everybody had as like a late first round pick this year, and everybody is souring on because of Gio Bernard's role in the passing game. But Joe Mixon is 5,900, and there's going to be a week at some point where they like scheme him more into the passing game. There just is.
You'd hope so.
There just has to be. I mean, they paid him for a reason, right? So like, I think he's an interesting guy to take some shots on in tournaments, especially if you're playing that Philadelphia game, because both those teams, have played pretty fast in terms of pace. Cincinnati got off like 60 pass plays on Thursday night last week. So I think Mixon would be a low-owned target in GPPs as well.
It seems like Mixon kind of falls in a dead range for me only because they're not passing to him enough out of the backfield. And I get the logic behind it, but it's also a tough run defense against Philly. It's like the one part of their defense that's actually playing well. So it's the potential high volume guy, but all the guys right next to him are all potential high volume guys in like really crappy matchups. Like Melvin Gordon's the last man standing in Denver, but he reeks. He has to like luck his way into a touchdown if that's going to be the case for him. So I don't like that. David Montgomery is like, ugh, if they're going to be behind, is he even going to be on the field? They might end up throwing like Cordero Patterson. Darrell Henderson's the only healthy running back for the Rams, but the other two might end up playing. And then David Johnson, I still don't know the status of Duke Johnson, but even if he plays, does it really matter? But it's against Pittsburgh, so do you even want to play him at this point? Because David Johnson is the perfect example of this. And I know that taking a one-case scenario and looking at it over a week is like, oh, that's stupid. We should actually do this most of the time, where it's a good running back who has all the volume in a bad matchup. This is a perfect leverage play. People did that with David Johnson last week against Baltimore. It just didn't work.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'd point out about trying to do that against Baltimore is it's really hard to get volume against Baltimore because they limit plays so steadily. So even if you're getting a high percentage of the share, it's hard to maintain drives against them, and it's hard to keep them from not grinding the clock because they run the ball so effectively. So this is where I think I think if you're going to take shots like of that group, give me the guy who has some juice in Joe Mixon. And we've seen Philadelphia like play down to their competition through the first 2 weeks of the season. They have not looked like a good team. I know, run defense has been a strength for them, especially over the years. But they have not looked like a good team just in general right now. And so I think Mixon I think he's going to be sub 5%.
Well, we've just talked about every running back and how you should play all of them. So when they go off, you can credit us for that one. So just to kind of recap running backs a little bit, Sanders is the play.
Yeah, I think Sanders is the top play. I would say that for me, Zeke and Henry are both very strong high-end spends. I think the depth of the position makes it so that they're not a necessity. I think Connor, Carson, and Eckler are really, really strong plays, and I'm really interested to see where projected ownership comes in on them. And I think Kenyon Drake is a really strong play. I honestly you can consider like Mike Davis as a cash game option, but I'd really prefer to stay 6K and above for my cash game running backs this week. I think you can kind of look in other places to get salary relief. If you need to go down, the guy Mike Davis is going to project as the best cash game option because of the passing game volume. But if you're going down in tournaments, it would be Jeff Wilson for me. And then I think Joe Mixon is the sub 5% owned guy that has some juice to him. Whereas some of these other sub 5% owned guys like Melvin Gordon, David Montgomery, I don't think they've got like the juice to break off a couple big runs and change the slate.
Yeah, you're really going to have to luck into like 2 or 3 touchdowns from these guys if you want to break a slate, and that's just hard to bank on. So we move to wide receiver, and I want to apologize to everyone I yelled at the very beginning of the show about not talking about main slate games. I completely forgot that the Packers and Saints game was the Sunday night game. For whatever reason, I thought it was one of the late games. There's a lot of good late games this week is the problem when you pack it all into it. But DeAndre Hopkins is the healthy guy. He's number 1. He's $7,900. Then you got Julio, who's like missing practice, but nothing new for Julio. $7,400. Calvin Ridley is $72. Stefan Diggs, who no one is going to use this week, is $7,000. Then you have Thielen, Evans, Godwin, who should return, Juju, Amari Cooper, and DK Metcalf. So I think you have a few options here. It seems like everyone is going to use DeAndre Hopkins because he's the healthy elite option. He's been amazing through 2 games. Julio, no one is going to use because he's coming off a bad game and he's already banged up. Ridley, they will go to. No one's going to use Diggs, although I have been told by Tim Andercust that Diggs is the must sit of the week, and he may or may not have a bet where he projected Stefan Diggs for fewer than 8 fantasy points this week. So could be a nice upside situation for a low-owned Steph Diggs, who's looked pretty amazing in the first 2 games. Yeah. But it does seem like, Seattle, Dallas, jam. That's the move.
Yeah. I think the top-owned wide receivers are going to be, the Seattle-Dallas guys, Lockett, Amari Cooper, DK Metcalf. They're all pretty much priced identically, 6,400, 6,500. I think DeAndre Hopkins is going to garner a lot of ownership. And then I think depending on Julio's situation, if the reports are still that he's like questionable and kind of limpy, I think Ridley will command ownership. The rest of that graphic, not going to command ownership, right? Adam Thielen, really interesting tournament play this week. There should be a lot of volume there. At some point, their plays are going to regress where they're going to actually be able to run enough plays. I know it doesn't feel like the right matchup to do it against a Tennessee team that can dominate time of possession, but he's going to be an interesting tournament play. And then, we'll see if Kenny Golladay returns. He's 6,200 in a really good game environment against Arizona after Terry McLaurin kind of went off against them last week. I could see him garnering some ownership if you got really, really promising practice reports. But otherwise, it'll be really interesting because I think there's a lot of guys, let's say below that Lockett, Metcalf, Cooper range that have compelling matchups or compelling volume, but it's so easy to get to Cooper and Lockett and Metcalf that I think their ownership is going to be pushed way down.
Do you have a preference? Like, how do we approach, maybe we just take a sidebar and talk about this Dallas and Seattle game, because that's the game that everyone wants a piece of. How do you go about that? Like, do you play, Kevin Adams from FTN won a bunch of money last week by, some people say, oh, well, that's the game everyone's stacking. So, I'll take the pieces that, no one wants, or I'll fade that game and try to get tricky. He went the other way. He just overexposed himself to that game and just took more of this instead of there was like a triple stack and then a double stack coming back. Like, if you really do believe that this is the game where all the points are going to be, is that the move in this circumstance? Is not only stack, but stack way more than everyone else?
So I think the answer really depends on where the ownership lies. And so this is something that I touched on in my GPP leverage column at Established Run last week, which was essentially that Atlanta-Dallas was the clear top targeted game on the slate for me. It was highlighted in Pat Thorman's snaps and pace column that we have on our site as a game that was pace up for both teams. It was 2 teams that had pretty good price tags on their wide receivers and 2 quarterbacks that were pretty compelling to stack because the offenses are concentrated in terms of who they throw the ball to. And I think that all those cases can be made once again for Dallas and Seattle. The thing is, last week, all of their receivers, the projected ownership was like 15 to 20. And I thought that was too low. So I was also very overweight this game in general and had a lot of it. And the way that I decided to differentiate myself was all of my Dak stacks, I removed Ezekiel Elliott from. My thought process on that was just that Dak and Zeke are going to be so owned individually that the combination of them is going to be more owned than it probably should be. And so I'm just going to focus my attention on the receiving options. It got me onto like 5 to 10% Dalton Schultz. It got me overweight Cooper, Gallup, and CeeDee Lamb. And then I was overweight the Atlanta wide receivers. And if you're overweight Ridley enough in those, you get some combinations that work. And so the question for me this week is, where will this ownership come in? If it's in that 15 to 25% mark, again, I think it's all systems go and you take advantage and you start to try to play it heavily. But I think if it gets into the 25 to 35 range, now you're starting to kind of face an uphill battle in terms of getting to the top of the leaderboard with that game. And that's where I might play a little bit more Chris Carson if he's going to end up being low owned, and hope the let Russ cook movement takes a week off and Seattle decides to go back to their kind of slow paced, control the clock ways and keep Dallas's offense off the field, which I could certainly see them approaching that game with. But the answer to your question, Pat, is ultimately it really comes down to what I think the ownership is going to be by the end of the week. And that's something I just don't have a good feel for until we get more clarity on injury situations.
So what do you do with just independently these wide receivers? Because like you said, they're very close in price.
Yeah.
DK Metcalf, 65, Tyler Lockett is 64. I always think that the higher upside kind of rests with DK Metcalf, but I just see this as such a good spot for Tyler Lockett.
Yeah, I have no idea how to separate them, honestly. I mean, I think Lockett's one of the most efficient receivers in the history of the NFL. When you look at yards per target, you look at catch rate. Metcalf is just an absolute physical freak and is the guy that you would think would be more targeted heavily in the red zone, but also has the big playability, as we saw last week, to break off these big plays. So they're indistinguishable to me. I think we have Lockett slightly ahead between the two, but both great values. I mean, both two of the top 6 or 7 values at the wide receiver position this week. Amari Cooper in that top 3 or 4 as well. So the way that I handle them generally, because I'm making a lot of lineups, is I basically kind of spread my exposures to 3 of them. So last week I capped my wide receiver exposures at like 25%. I had no wide receiver more than 25% of lineups. It will depend on the ownership projection of this game and what I'm trying to do, but in general, I try to cap my ownership exposure somewhere around 25 to 30, because what I want is there's always receivers coming out of nowhere for big games. Like last week, it was Stephon Diggs, who was like 2% owned. I probably had like 10 to 15% of him because I capped my ownership on some of the higher end options. And I took a position against like Devontae Adams last week. And so I think that's a way to approach tournaments. And it just really comes down to the difference between, and I know it seems small and minuscule to people out there, but the difference between a player owned at 15% and owned at 25% is really big in terms of the bar that they need to hit from a production standpoint to really separate you from the field.
So what about the Dallas side? Like you said, you have Amari Cooper projected very highly, but I think I think he may be the lowest owned of the Dallas receivers. There's always going to be
interesting.
There's the narrative that he doesn't play very well outside. The other guys are both cheaper, and if you want to use Metcalf or Lockett, you can have a little bit of savings if you go down to Lamb or Gallup in this spot. I don't think it's going to be like substantial, but I don't think that Cooper stands out in ownership, at least in my mind, the way that I'm kind of piecing this all together, because everyone's paying down for Schultz.
So I think Gallup is going to be the lowest owned of the Dallas receivers because he just hasn't had the production that's like shown up in the box score yet. And people love when they make their lineups, they love clicking on that DraftKings profile. They love looking at the fantasy points in the most recent games. And Amari Cooper, I believe, has hit the 100-yard bonus in both games. So he's had pretty good box scores. CeeDee Lamb got the 100-yard bonus last week, so he's had decent box scores. And CeeDee Lamb, I think, is going to draw the wide receiver cornerback matchup in terms of playing in the slot with what Seattle is allowed to slot receivers, as we saw with Julian Edelman last week. I think he'll draw some of the attention there. So I think Gallup is going to be the piece that's a little bit less owned of the trio. Schultz is interesting to see where the ownership is because tight end is tricky this week. There's nobody sub 3,500 that people are going to be excited to play. And so you get all these guys that are like 37 to 45 or so that people are going to be kind of batting around. So I'm interested to see, but I think Gallup will be the lowest owned of that group. I don't think he'll be, I think he might be sub 10, but might be like that 7-8 range where it's not super low, but it's low enough that you can kind of play and take an overweight position on in GPPs. But I like Cooper the most. I do want to see where his ownership comes in. If you think it's going to be lower, then I'm even more excited to play him.
Yeah, that's just my initial lean on it. I think there's enough narratives that you can build against Amari Cooper that, people who build, I mean, you're talking about building a lot of lineups too. If I was only building like three lineups, how do I approach this game? Do you really just have to make concrete positions and hope you're right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where when you're only making a handful of lineups, you do have to kind of take stands, and that's the difference between like talking about lineup sets when you're making 150 versus when you're making 20 versus when you're making 10 versus when you're making 5 or 3. I mean, 3 you have to make a big stand, right? Like you're probably going to play at minimum every time you play guys in 33% of your lineup, so you're already bigly overweight most guys. So yeah, you just based on the number of lineups you're creating, it really does impact the stands that you take.
So what about the tertiary pieces of this game? We talked about Schultz. You say that Carson, I think that Carson could be decent leverage in this game. People are going to use Zeke regardless. Does that leave like founder of Mickey Mouse, Walt Disley, as someone you could use?
Yeah. Disley is probably pretty fringy. But in large lineup sets, I think you could use that. Russ does spread it around enough that there would be some opportunity there. What I would be looking for from this game is one of the main skill players that their ownership projection comes in around 10% or below. Anybody that you get on that, whether it's the 2 primary Seattle receivers, which I don't think they'll qualify, whether it's one of the 3 Dallas wide receivers, which I think Gallup will qualify, but we'll see, or whether it's Carson, who maybe has a chance to get there, those plays I think would be really good leverage plays and plays to, if you want to play this game heavily and against chalk, like let's say you get a situation where Cooper and Lamb are projected at 20 to 25% ownership, Lockett and Metcalf are 20 to 25% ownership, and you still want to play this game. Maybe you go away from the quarterbacks and you play Gallup and you play Carson, and you hope that Gallup hits one of those big plays down the field, and you hope Seattle takes kind of the approach that they've taken for the last few years and take the air out of the ball and run the ball. And that's the way you kind of get contrarian exposure to this game.
I'm just really having a tough time wrapping my mind around it. Like I didn't have enough of the Dallas and Falcons game last week, and it really came back to bite me. Like the 2 things I've decided to fade through 2 weeks are Josh Jacobs in week 1 and that game in week 2. So at least I was able to get onto the good players in week 1. Wasn't able to manage that so much in week 2. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I like lighting money on fire. That's one of my favorite things to do in life, apparently, when I'm playing DraftKings lineups. But is there any case you can make to fade this game?
The case that I would make to fade this game is going to be almost solely based on ownership, and then I'm going to talk myself into the narrative that Seattle's going to want to keep Dallas's offense off the field and revert to the way they were in the past, and then we saw kind of the Rams have that success in week 1 against Dallas, just kind of running the ball down their throats. It's a hard narrative to swallow, so it's not one I want to go down, but it really comes down to the ownership. And I think if you still want to play this game into chalk ownership, the other way to think about it is, so like last week I was playing a lot of Dallas Atlanta, and that meant I could not make lineups where I played all 3 of Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Ezekiel Elliott. And so I made that Dak rule to make sure I didn't have Zeke with Dak. And that got me a lot more Aaron Jones, who was kind of my leverage play on Devontae Adams. I knew there was heavy ownership on Devontae Adams. I knew that and the combination of the running back ownership through those 3 guys was going to keep Aaron Jones low. And now if I hit on Aaron Jones in a big way, I can still play these chalk stacks. So you got to find that guy. You got to find that sub 10, sub 5% guy that's at the running back or the wide receiver position that has the upside of all these other options, and you got to make sure they're in your lineup. You can still play chalk game stacks, but you need to make sure you have a few low-owned pieces alongside them.
Is there any merit to like the random other pieces here, whether it be David Moore, who I thought was like kind of banged up with a hamstring injury, but apparently he's going to be fine.
Yeah, I don't think so. So the way that I think about it in terms of like opportunity set, if David Moore hits 1 deep ball, and that's kind of his ceiling performance, right? Like he's probably not going to hit 2 deep balls in a game. So let's say he goes like 3 for 60 in a touchdown. That's 15 DraftKings points. That is not burying anyone in a tournament. That is easily overcomable everywhere else. I just don't think he had I don't even know what his price is, but I assume it's not much. I don't think they have the upside to really do it, especially the wide receivers, especially with the condensed target share on the Dallas guys. There's nobody on Dallas that even plays in the field enough to consider. It would only be Seattle guys. If you were going to do it at a spot, Disley or Olsen would be the guys, just because the tight end bar to clear from a production standpoint is much lower than wide receiver, right? Like there's so many wide receivers out there in a given week that most weeks 15 or 10 or 12 isn't going to be enough unless you hit the nuts everywhere else. And so, but some weeks 10 or 12, like we saw week 1, a 0 almost won the Millie Maker at tight end. Like the tight end bar is much, much lower to clear. I know that wasn't the case last week. Tight ends went nuts last week. But so if you're going to do it, Disley or Olsen would be the guys. But in general, I'm kind of on the focus guys or not, and hoping one of the focus guys slips through the cracks with ownership.
So for me, when I take a look at it, I kind of like, I like Lockett the best out of all of these guys. If I think if I'm going to use a one-off, it would be him. But like, I really like Allen Robinson at $6,200. Like he is so set up well for this game against the Falcons, who have a horrific defense, but they can score points, which is great news. I love Atlanta's defense, spoiler alert, once we get down to it, but you're going to force Trubisky, at least in my mind, to throw 40 to 50 times in this game. If that's the case,
I assume you got to like that Atlanta side too. That number opened up, I think it opened up at 3.
Yeah,
I was surprised by that.
But I can see, like, I think this is where people get mixed up a lot when it comes to defenses, or like, I think that the Bears could score 35 points and the Falcons defense could score 20. Like, I don't think those things are necessarily mutually exclusive. True. So if Trubisky's just going to be chucking the entire game, like I was just casually strolling along. I was at ftndaily.com looking at the unrealized air yards, and I was like, oh, Allen Robinson. It turns out he has like a 71% market share of targets plus air yards on this team. Like his first 2 weeks should have been huge, and they weren't. So now we're in a situation where no one wants to play him because they want to play all these guys in these other games. This could be like a 15 target game for Allen Robinson.
Certainly. I think he's a very strong tournament play. I think he will get lost in the mix this week. I think projection systems are probably going to like DJ Moore in that range, right? Because you remove a bunch of Christian McCaffrey targets, you make the team a little bit pass happier. And even in a tough matchup, you just have a lot of volume for a player that, if you think about how Carolina's offense is probably going to operate against the Chargers defense that is a very, very good pass rush, they're probably going to try to get the ball out of their hands quickly and into playmakers who can get yards after the catch. And that is more of a DJ Moore thing than a Robbie Anderson thing. Robbie Anderson's a little bit more down the field. So I think DJ Moore will garner some ownership from that group. It'll be interesting to see how people treat like Odell. I mean, Washington's secondary is not very good, but nobody wants to play Odell is my guess. I'm guessing nobody wants to play guys against Buffalo. So Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods are probably going to have modest ownership. So I think like this whole range around Metcalf and Lockett and Cooper is so interesting because I don't think there's going to be like any ownership there. And every time you click one of these guys into your lineup, even if it's not a Dallas-Seattle stack, and you're going to be like, oh, I have 100 left over, I should probably play Tyler Lockett. like you're just going to get off all these guys the whole time. So I think they're really interesting tournament plays. I think Allen Robinson is the best of the bunch, but I think you can make a case for all those guys in that range because I think they're going to be so lowly owned.
And I think that's going to maybe, I put it this way, spoiler alert, I'm going to end up fading that stupid Dallas and Seattle game. Again, I'm going to lose all my money this week. But the 1 week that it hits, Drew, I see it to work once in 16 weeks. That's all
playing DFS tournaments is. You're just looking for 1 week a year to make up for the whole year.
But if you really take a close look at that low sixes, you mentioned some of those names. The best matchup of the week, per Jeff Radcliffe's wide receiver versus cornerback, and there's a shadow index too to see how much that cornerback is going to be on that receiver. Again, ftndaily.com, code Mayo. Find all this stuff pretty easily. But I'll just give some away right now. Keenan Allen has the best matchup of the week on Jeremy Chin. Like one of the best, it's not even the best by a little bit. It's the best matchup by a lot of any receiver this week. And it did seem like almost like how Macho Man felt like Hulk Hogan had the eyes for Miss Elizabeth. Herbert has some eyes for Keenan Allen, almost like how Tyrod kind of liked Mike Williams. Herbert, he likes himself some Keenan Allen. So he has the best matchup. Julian Edelman's going up against LaMarcus Joyner in the slot, and he just gets absolutely torched the entire game. Yep. And if you add an Allen Robinson to that mix, like why couldn't that be your receiving core?
It could, and it will come like
15%,
12% ownership. like maybe combined one of the Seattle Dallas wide receivers in ownership, maybe. Like, yeah, these are good tournament plays. They're direct leverage, or direct pivots. I shouldn't say leverage, direct pivots off of chalky options. And it really depends on how much of the ownership really condenses on those three guys in the Dallas Seattle game.
So rest of them, we just talked about like who the plays are going to be this week. So if we just think about like the rest of the slate, where are the actual value plays popping up? Because I'm just kind of scrolling my mind down here. Like if you hit in the fives, like I think Deontay Johnson might be just a better player or a better fantasy option than Juju is. So that you could just play.
I hope not, because I didn't draft it that way, but it might be. It might be the case. It certainly could be the case. So yeah, he's a player that I think will command some attention in the fives.
Like with no pass rush and a banged up secondary, are we now looking at Darius Slayton as someone who, because if people are going to be like, oh, no Sterling Shepard, fire up Evan Ingram, fire up Golden Tate. This is too tough of a matchup for Slayton, but maybe not. Yeah,
I think Slayton will certainly be in there. Definitely no Shepard. Tate's been banged up too, so it'll be interesting to see how healthy he is, because he missed time in week 1, and Slayton's been kind of the guy there. So I think he's a big play threat, but I don't think he'll command ownership, simply because the Giants offense isn't one people are going to want to invest in heavily. You've also got Deshaun Jackson with no Jalen Reagor, and everybody playing Miles Sanders. And if Deshaun Jackson hits, let me tell you about how things go if Deshaun Jackson hits. They are like 3-play drives, 2-play drives, and they suck out all the volume around him. This is like kind of the Tyreek Hill corollary as well, where when Tyreek Hill has his really big games, a lot of other Chiefs don't have big games around him because their play volume gets cut so much that the reception volume goes down. And so Deshaun Jackson is one of these guys that if he hits, it's immediately a huge ding on someone like Miles Sanders or Zach Ertz, somebody who relies on that play volume.
If we go to Deshaun Jackson, he has the second most air yards of any player in the NFL so far. You mentioned Reagor's out to like December at this point. And if you're going to go after the Bengals, it seems like you can do it anywhere on the field. It'd be a good way to get like off the schneid just a little bit to try to connect on a deep pass at least once. I like that play, and he burned everyone in week 1 too. So I'm guessing that people don't want to go back to him. So I like him. Do you know who has the most air yards in the league by a ton?
I do not.
AJ Green.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I totally forgot about the Bengals in general. We were just talking about that game, so I should have remembered. But teams that play on Thursday night and like all the Twitter drama about those teams happens Thursday night and then Friday, you like totally forget whatever happened to them in that week. And I know everybody was debating whether AJ Green is washed or whether he's a buy low, or it is what it is. But I mean, yeah, there was a lot of opportunity there, and not a lot that was catchable. So, like, I don't think you can really blame him for a lot of those air yards being left on the field until we see a few more balls that are within range of being catchable, and then we can make assessments on AJ Green.
Yeah, well, you have like this old man tier. It's like AJ Green. No one wants to play T.Y. Hilton anymore. Although he dropped a touchdown, like he should have had a good game, but did. Now he gets the Jets, who are like if you wanted to play like the Colts stack, you could play Pittman in it, I guess, or even play Hines or one of the running backs or Mo Alley Cox if Doyle doesn't play. But I just have no faith in Phillip Rivers.
It's tough, but it is a great situation because you expect the Colts to be able to score points against the Jets. You expect there to be some carryover ownership from Jonathan Taylor's performance last week. And you expect there to be almost no ownership on Hilton and Pittman. Mo Alley Cox might get some ownership, as you said, if Doyle sits. And they just lost Paris Campbell. So there's the potential for the targets tightening. I know Frank Reich's offense has kind of been a little bit more, shared snaps and different things behind Hilton in the past, but their opportunity would be there, and the price tags are pretty good on all those guys. So I think they're really solid tournament plays as well. I think if you want to look at like the chalk is the Dallas Seattle receivers. Then I think Deontay Johnson is probably pretty chalky. And then I think all these guys that are around these price tags that are kind of close to them are just going to fall through the wayside.
Pittman at 4,000. I like. Is there anyone from like down there, like Braxton Berrios? Does he do it for you?
I got some guys. All
right, let's hear them.
So I know it was the Keenan Allen show last week, but Mike Williams is 4,300, and I think the Chargers are going to go up and down the field against Carolina. I think they're going to score a lot of points. So I feel like having exposure to Mike Williams, a player who can hit big plays in tournaments, makes a lot of sense. I don't think there'll be ownership there. N'Keal Harry at 4,200, I think, is too cheap for a guy who is probably going to see decent volume week in and week out, probably somewhere around 6 to 8 targets each week. I think he had double digits last week. I think that'll come down certainly a bit in this matchup against Las Vegas, where they should be able to run the ball a little bit more effectively. And then I think the guy that everybody's going to talk about this week is KJ Hamler at 3,000.
Yeah.
I mean, no Cortland Sutton. Hamler looked good. They invested draft capital in him. He's a guy that just needs one play to change everything. His playerprofiler.com comp is Deshaun Jackson. I think that's who he plays a lot like. The question is, will Denver manufacture some touches for him so that there's a little bit of a floor? Because the way this type of player typically runs their routes, someone who is, my size, and I'm not a large gentleman, they usually run them very far down the field or very close to the line of scrimmage. There's not a lot in between. So the question is, will Denver manufacture any touches for him? But I think Hamler at 3,000 really opens up a lot of stuff. And then I would also say, in that 4,000 range, Curtis Samuel, nobody's going to play him. And what if the Panthers recognize that this guy who's been kind of a multi-purpose positional player, punt returner, does some stuff in the screen game. What if they realize, hey, we can line this guy up in the backfield and get a little bit more explosiveness in our lineup than Mike Davis? And not that he'll get a bunch of carries, but maybe they just design some more plays for him in that manner. I think that's a very viable way for them to replace some of the stuff they do with Christian McCaffrey. And nobody's going to play him. People are going to play Mike Davis. I think some people are going to play DJ Moore. I don't think anybody's playing Curtis Samuel.
Interesting. I don't think I want to play Curtis Samuel either, to tell you the truth. And I'll probably fade Hamler as well. Just maybe I'll go when he busts this week, I'll use him next week.
Hamler, I think, is going to get ownership, and that's the tricky part, because I think he might end up getting 10% owned, and a 10% owned guy that has in his probably bottom 30% range of outcomes or zeros. You got to be careful with in terms of how you're playing them.
As a general rule of thumb, this is why I didn't end up with Scotty Miller on any of my teams last week. You give me the chalky, cheap receiver, pass. Just every
usually
time.
A bad play.
It'll work out 25% of the time, and that's good enough for me to pass on.
Even Corey Davis last week, who it worked with because he scored a touchdown, it was 14 DraftKings points or something like that. That's not going to bury you from a 4K wide receiver. And that's kind of the thing. Most of these guys, now Hamler is a guy that could, just because it could be one or two big plays and he could get 18 DraftKings points at 3K. But I still don't I don't think he's a bad fade by any means, especially if he gets 10% owned, and I think there's a chance he does.
Let's talk about tight ends. We've kind of talked about the top of all of these positions, and the most expensive is going to be Kittle. Whether he plays or not, I don't know. Higbee's coming off 3 touchdowns, but apparently the Eagles are the new Cardinals, where tight end they've got 4 tight end touchdowns in 2 weeks. And Waller coming off the big Monday night game. I think Fant is in a really interesting spot here. If everyone's going to use Hamler, that Fant will just be doesn't have the name value to be priced up with these guys as of yet. So no one's going to use him. You can talk yourself into Ertz or Goddard because there's no Rager around. I can see people doing that. Hunter Henry is somewhat interesting, but I just like to pay down. So Mo Alley Cox. You can go back to Logan Thomas if you want at $3,700. Drew Sample against the Eagles without CJ Uzma around $3,500. Everyone will want to use Jordan Reed. But here's the problem with Jordan Reed. He played 26% of the snaps last week. And most of his damage was done with Jimmy G, not necessarily from Nick Mullins, who's probably going to start. That feels like a trap.
Yeah, the Jordan Reed thing was very frustrating to me because there was a news blurb that was reported, I think, on Friday of last week, that in an article that was written by one of the San Fran beat writers that basically said the team we got 10 plays for Jordan Reed, and that's a good amount of plays, and we'll work up to a little bit more, but not too much more than that. We've got a good group of tight ends. And so I literally thought this guy might play 15 snaps. And I was at 15 snaps, I just got to remove him from my player pool. Even if they, even if they're concentrated targets on that, there's no way he's getting more than 5 targets and I thought he was going to be owned. So that was a disaster. And that is the risk. The risk is he's not going to play a ton. The good news is clearly when he's on the field, they're going to be running plays for him, as we saw last week. So I think he's still in the mix. I, too, like to pay down at the tight end position. I think the thing that I'm struggling with so much at the tight end position is, like, these prices on Zach Ertz and Hunter Henry are really good. They're really not that much different, especially when Logan Thomas and Mo Alley-Cox and Drew Sample, they're not low threes anymore. They're more mid or high threes. These are pretty good prices. And so that's where I kind of struggle. It makes lineup construction a little bit challenging. Like that extra, $1,500 kind of goes a long way. But, I'd really like to get Ertz and Hunter Henry, those types of guys in my lineups now. I also just like those offenses as a whole. So it's hard when you want to play the running backs from those teams to play the running back and tight end from the teams. It just doesn't make sense for tournaments. So I will probably have a little bit more spread out exposure here. But of the cheap guys, who do you think has the highest ceiling? Like, who do you think can really, really blow up the slate from the, let's say 4K and under guys?
Based on the target share that these guys get, if there's no Jack Doyle, I think Mo Alley-Cox actually has a legit case to be the number one guy just because of his athletic profile. I don't know if you watched the broadcast, but apparently he played basketball. I had
never known.
I heard that.
Unbelievable. This day and age, not knowing that a tight end played basketball. It's incredible. What did he play? AAU?
Yeah. Who even knows at this point? But with him, where he has so much speed, and they're just decimated, and it's against the Jets. And he ended up with over 100 yards last week. He gets a touchdown. All of a sudden, he's at 25 DraftKings points. He scores 2 touchdowns. He's pushing 30. So, I mean, that's a lot to ask. But you talk about actual upside. I do think it's him. I just think that no one's going to use Logan Thomas after everyone used Logan Thomas last week. And it's a good situation. He's getting a high. The problem with that offense is that they run so slow, and Haskins just he'll take 2 shots with McLaurin downfield, and that's kind of it. So that's kind of a bummer. But I got one for you. Jonnu Smith popped up with an unknown injury on the injury report on Wednesday. No one knows what it is right now. But he might not play. He missed practice. Now, maybe he will end up playing.
Guy.
And now we have everyone's most creative way to spell Michael in history, Michael Pruitt. $2,500.
Oh, you're going that route. I thought you were going with...
No.
I thought you were going with the Ferkser.
No. $2,500 against the Vikings. It could be Ferkser, who's also super cheap.
It could be the Ferkser. Tennessee definitely likes to throw to their tight ends, likes to utilize them. I think if Jonnu was ruled out, regardless, because I do think that role would be split between Pruitt and Ferkser, it would be a tournament-only play.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But at $2,500 in play. In tournaments. I mean, I think the gap between them and the next tier is pretty substantial. You mentioned Mo Alley-Cox as the guy with the highest upside. And I think I agree with that group. I think him and Logan Thomas definitely have the best athletic profile and the best, target share. But I think I trust, and it feels weird to say I trust Phillip Rivers. I trust Indy's offense to generate more scoring opportunities than I do Thomas and Washington's offense with Haskins. So I think Cox would be the guy that I would prefer as well to Thomas in those situations, assuming Jack Doyle is out. But Herndon is
that was the one I was going to bring up because
what do you do here?
One target last week. What do you do? If you want to go YOLO, why not?
I mean, theoretically, in a theoretical world, he should be getting targets without Jamison Crowder, without any semblance of a receiving core. Theoretically, that should be the case. But last week was just what on earth is going on with the Jets offense? So I don't know. I will have some in tournaments because I don't think he'll be owned, but it is a tough situation to project that Jets offense.
Yeah, I actually do like Sample a little bit. I like Cox the best, but I do like Sample down there. I think
Sample, if he gets there, it's volume oriented though.
Agreed.
I don't think he's cracking big plays, but he could.
It could be 7 for 75 and a touchdown, which at $3,500, sign me out.
I mean, that's a smash. Yeah.
Quarterbacks and stacks. We've already talked through the Dallas and the Seattle side of things. They're going to be the 2 highest priced quarterbacks. They're going to be the 2 highest owned quarterbacks. At least that would be my guess. If you're not going to use those 2 as your quarterback, Kyler, I assume, will be the next highest owned one, and then probably Cam. That leaves, if you wanted an elite pivot, would be Josh Allen. who can run who can run 3 touchdowns in on his own, and no one's using Diggs either. But
nobody's using Kupp and Woods either.
Yeah, Goff sucks, so I wouldn't do that. But
but I'm saying from a game stack perspective.
Yeah, and listen, a revenge game for Robert Woods, you could do worse. But other than that, there is one sneaky guy here at $5,200. There's actually 2, because I think that Nick Mullins is like kind of good, and he's only $5,100, but I can just see them running the entire time. But Teddy B at 52. His offense runs at a bit of pace. And I'm just interested to see what it looks like without McCaffrey, because I don't think they're going to turn around and hand the ball off to Mike Davis 25 times in this game. I just really don't. I can see them getting down early. And as Feinberg has pointed out, Chargers love to play to their competition. They play someone good, they'll look good. They play someone bad, they'll look bad. Like, they're going to get pressure on Bridgewater. He's going to have to get the ball out quickly. Those 2 corners are horrendous matchups, but there's just something drawing me to Teddy Bridgewater and just this Panthers team in general. Like, they could have covered each of the past 2 weeks and fucked it up with 5 minutes to go. Like, I don't know, just a really terrible play.
I like the Panthers offense in general. I think it's a tough week for Teddy because I think the offensive line concerns against this Chargers pass rush is going to be a challenge for Teddy, who already takes a lot of sacks. That's been kind of his issue throughout his career. So I think they're going to get a lot of drives stalled out, and I don't expect them to score a ton of touchdowns. So I think the receivers can get there via yardage and catches and volume, but I think the quarterback, you always need the touchdowns. And I just don't know if they can score 3 or 4 offensive touchdowns in this game through the air. And that's really what you need. Even though he's cheap, you still need that. So I'm probably off Teddy. I would say
Trubisky?
Trubisky is okay, but the cheap guys that I would look to, Carson Wentz is 5,800. He's been awful, just terrible so far. But again, if you want leverage off of the Miles Sanders chalk, you've got a good price on Carson Wentz, and you've got good prices on Ertz and Deshaun Jackson. And that's immediate leverage off against a Cincy team that defensively has not looked very good. And then I think Justin Herbert in that game, again, like, if you like Keenan Allen, Mike Williams is pretty cheap. Hunter Henry's pretty cheap. Austin Eckler's cheap enough that you could pair him with Herbert as well with the passing game. And so Herbert's got a little bit of juice to him with the legs. And so I think he's a good sub 6K. Those are the guys that I would probably look to first.
All right, so let's talk about these defenses then. I told you I like Atlanta, and the numbers don't really match up for me on this one. Usually I just look at adjusted sack rate for, adjusted sack rate against, and that just leads you directly to the Steelers at $4,000 because they are the best pressure team in football against the second worst offensive line in football. That makes a lot of sense. I find it really hard to pay up $4,000 for a defense, but this feels like the first time this year that the defense that is, I mean, they're not the highest owned, but or the highest price, but at $4,000, they feel like they should get you like at least 12 points. But I just look at the Cardinals, and I just how this game script comes out in my mind. Atlanta gets up early in these games, and then they allow teams to come back in the game. But if that forces Trubisky, like I said, to pass between 40 and 50 times in a game, I will take any defense against Mitch Trubisky when he's throwing 45 times in a game. I don't care.
I would agree with that. I would say the 2 teams when I first started scanning that stood out to me, that prices I thought were accessible, which I thought pricing on DraftKings defenses was tough this week, was the Falcons and the Eagles. Now, our projections don't like the Falcons quite as much. They like the Giants, actually, a little bit more, because I guess Mullins has taken a ton of sacks in his brief time in the NFL.
But they were that was back when the San Francisco offensive line was
tricky,
trash.
but he took sacks last week too, so I don't know. But yes, I agree. It's I like, my instinct is more Falcons and Eagles as like the 2 mid-tier plays, and then you've been saying it. The challenge is there that if the game plays the way that everybody expects the game to play, they're not going to get a lot of opportunities. But the Jets at 2,000, if you don't trust Phillip Rivers, if you don't trust Phillip Rivers and you think that game's going to play closer, like, the Jets at 2,000 have to be under consideration just because they're cheap.
I suppose that's true. I was more like just because it sounds like we've talked about a lot of ways where you can save money on this slate. I don't mind the Washington footballs against Baker Mayfield and their pressure rate at $3,000. Like no one wants a piece of them because they didn't beat Arizona last week. Like okay, they still sacked Kyler 3 times and chased him around the entire time. Haskins not quite as elusive as I've seen as Kyler Murray is, and no one wants a piece of them. So I don't mind that. And I'm just looking at the pressure rates right now. Like even to look at it, like Cleveland and Chicago are both like really high in adjusted sack rate. They don't give up a ton of sacks. So that's interesting. If we look the other way and see who the worst teams are, you have the Giants, and actually San Francisco's second in adjusted sack rate.
But they just lost.
No, I mean like second worst. Like second worst offensive line.
Okay. Yeah.
So the Giants have the worst, and the Niners have the second worst. Like, could you just take the Niners? Because everyone's out on their team, but like they're still going up against Daniel Jones.
Yeah, I mean Daniel Jones is like a free turnover or 2 a week, right? So I don't hate it, but it's 3,500. At 3,500, I'd rather play the Chargers, who I think are going to get a lot of sack opportunities against Teddy Bridgewater. I might rather play the Steelers too. But yeah, the 49ers are certainly in range. They did lose a lot of defensive talent last week. I mean, that was a brutal game for injuries for them last week.
So how about this? The Patriots are generating pressure on the quarterback 34% of the time. Derek Carr is getting dropped on 8.7% of dropbacks.
But he doesn't take he historically has been very good at, because he just doesn't take chances. He doesn't really turn the ball over. He doesn't take sacks. He's been a tough guy to go against and get defensive volume with. That's the tricky part. And I would imagine that game plays pretty slow, right? Like you would think that we get more of week 1 New England offense than week 2 New England offense.
Yeah. I really wish the Panthers were able to keep up their pressure rate from last year. That has not been the case so far this year, because it'd be like, a rookie quarterback who just kind of runs around and flings it? Give me that guy.
They're one of our top 5 values just because of how cheap they are. Them and Houston and the Jets.
They have the
Eagles.
Put it this way, their pressure rate on the quarterback this season is 32nd at 4.6%. The next closest team is Chicago at 12.8.
So bad. Yeah, I mean, Carolina just totally overhauled the defense, and it's all a bunch of rookies, and it's just going to take some time. I think the Eagles are like the clear best like mid-tier defense, but I think they'll get ownership as a result, just because like Cincinnati threw the ball 60 times last game. They're gonna drop back, and you're gonna get a lot of opportunities, and they're a home favorite. So I think the Eagles will attract a lot of attention. But I think some of those teams you mentioned, I think the Falcons are an interesting pivot for sure.
I like the Falcons a lot, just based on the way I think that goes. I mean, you kind of talked me into the Jets.
I mean, you're the one telling me that you think that you don't trust Phillip Rivers and you don't want to trust like T.Y. Hilton or Jonathan Taylor. And it's like, okay, I thought you were setting me up this whole show for the Jets defense at 2K.
No, I just know you're a big Mitch guy, so I thought I'd try to needle you a little bit.
Yeah, I'm a huge Mitch guy. Yeah.
He's your guy.
Real big fan of Mitchell Trubisky and the Bears' decision-making all around him. Yeah.
But like the Jets are getting pressure, which frankly surprises me. Cincinnati is also getting a bunch of pressure right now too.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the way to go there, because Philly's just look bad.
Philly's offense has looked bad. And that would be a lot of leverage because Miles Sanders is just going to be so owned.
Yeah. I guess the only other way to get some leverage, could you go, and these are two teams that generate like basically zero pressure on the quarterback. Maybe this is the week. Dallas or Seattle? Like because people have this misconception like, if you give up 40 points, like if the team scores 40 points, it could be a return touchdown. It could be a pick six.
Yeah. Yeah, you could definitely go that route. I don't think I'll have much. I think better ways to get leverage on they should, if they were 2K, I think it would be different, but 2,900, 2,600 is kind of tough. So I probably won't have much. But yeah, in general, people do have misconceptions about how defenses reach their upside in the thought process of being in low scoring games. It's usually in higher scoring games.
Do we know if Tyron Smith's playing this week?
Don't know yet. I didn't see a Dallas practice report yet.
Because when he doesn't play, Dak takes sacks.
He does.
No, I don't want to do that.
Seattle's had a hard time.
That's stupid. Don't do that, Jamal.
They've had a hard time generating pressure. I don't think that's the route that I'd go to be contrarian this week.
Well, Jamal Adams is their best pass rusher somehow.
That's a I'm not sure if that's a indictment or if that's a, if that's a compliment.
It's clever scheming is what it is. So Falcons for me, just lock in the Falcons. If I can find a way to get up to the Steelers, I kind of like that as well, but probably not. Jets, $2,000. I'll just leave like 5,000 on the table this week. I'll be good. Drew Dinkmeyer. You can follow him on Twitter at Drew Dinkmeyer. And once again, if you go to at Drew Dinkmeyer on Twitter, what will they find as your pinned tweet up there at Drew Dinkmeyer?
Yeah, you'll find a pinned tweet giving you all the details. So there's a little video explaining kind of the purpose and the mission behind the Welly Maker 4.0, as long as a link that'll direct you to the page where you can donate if you'd like to, or learn more about the mission and more about Charity Water in general.
All right. I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me at the PME, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can check out Drew at establishtheRun.com as well. All of the stats that I've been talking about today have been coming empowered by FTNDaily.com. Quarterback matchups, optimizers, the defensive tools, the shadow rates. It's pretty amazing stuff. FTNDaily.com. Some of them are free. You can just go check out, like the Air Yards tool. Other than that, some of them are behind the paywall. Use code Mayo, get yourself a discount. You just tell them Pat Mayo sent you. You definitely get a discount on that. So I recommend you go check out FTNDaily.com. My cheat sheet will be up on DraftKingsNation.com on Thursday evening or Friday. I'll be back on Friday night to do an update on the ownership and the injury report. Then Sunday, live, 10 a.m. with Brad Evans. Be here on the Mayo Media Network. Like the episode, sub to the channel, and rate and review the podcast. All right? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
That Mayo experience! Experience!